All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. This is an educational channel, and we look into all kinds of stuff, but this particular segment is called Bible Decode. And we try to take a fresh look at the Old and New Testaments in order to give you some perspectives that are probably not represented by your authority figures or even your mentors or peers in the Bible. There's a lot of stuff that you kind of need to know about the Bible before you can even understand it on a deeper level. Um, there's a lot of history, there's a lot of context, and I mean, I'm not denigrating a different understanding. I think it's got layers, and you can get a good mileage from just the first couple layers. Just knowing the general story, and then having uh, a vocabulary of verses that you can draw upon on in various circumstances. That that can be useful, but to get to the next level with it, you really need to be able to understand kind of the context and the whole picture. What's actually going on here? And I think that unlocks um, a great deal of understanding that I think if we had that kind of understanding, that it wouldn't be such a divisive book, and um, there wouldn't be such radical uh, differences of opinion about what was going on here. Um, and what I've been looking at here on these in these episodes is the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. And that is simply that the true authors of the New Testament were the Roman Caesars, who wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Romans, against the Jews, sorry, and who the Romans had been in contention with for over a century, ever since the Romans colonized, conquered, took over in Judea for in 63 BC, over 125 years before later or earlier. The Jews had been basically colonized or conquered by a number of people before that. Before the Romans, it was the Greeks. Before the Greeks, it was the Persians. Before the Persians, it was the Babylonians. And so that goes back, 700-800 years before the Romans got there. And the Jews had this idea of a Messiah that was written in many of their scriptures, predicted that was going to come and help the Jews to overthrow these conquerors, these foreign conquerors. And what the Romans did instead is they made up a story of a different kind of Jewish Messiah, a Jewish Messiah named Jesus, who instead was a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and walking the extra mile and turning the other cheek, and otherwise being utterly deferential to Rome. So, not somebody who was going to kick out the Romans, but somebody who was going to accommodate to what the Romans wanted. And he did so also by denigrating the Jews whenever he had the chance, using violence if necessary, as when he overturned the tables of the money changers, the Jewish money changers at the temple, and yelled, berated the Jewish merchants selling animals for sacrifice at the temple, but especially as he whittled away at the Jewish traditions and rituals, and even trivialized the Jewish traditions and rituals, such as the circumcision, the kosher food dietary laws and cleanliness laws, the stricture against graven images, the observance of the Sabbath. These are all things that Jesus challenged, that they were all things that your average Jew follows them and places a high importance on being in observance of all of these strictures. But Jesus almost mocks them. He definitely flouts them, and breaks all of the rules. And then when he's called on it, he comes up with some type of technicality, an obscure line from scripture or something to that effect that gives him the right to do what he did. And so it's quite easy to imagine that this was concocted by the Romans. And, I'm not really telling you to believe that the Romans did this, but I am telling you that it does create a prima facie evidence that the Romans are the true authors, and that some research is necessary. You need to dig into this. You don't have to believe me when I tell you, but I think you should look into it a little bit more, because this truther movement here hasn't looked into it at all. I haven't heard the first word about any of the Roman origin hypothesis vectors that are out there. There's at least a dozen books out there on this subject that I even know about. There's probably some that I don't know about. And they all make a compelling case in one way or another for the Caesars to have written the New Testament. They had the motive, they had the means, they had the opportunity, and really they were the only people who had the means and the opportunity. And it was exactly the MO of the Romans. The Romans lived on word games, enigmas, coded language, wordplay, puns. And they also lived on creating religions out of nothing, and using them for the purposes of social control. And that's what they were trying to do here. They were trying to mellow out the Jews, to get them to get with the program, to assimilate to the empire strictures, as opposed to the separatist Jewish strictures. And then when you look at the direct evidence, it becomes pretty overwhelming. And that starts with the work of Josephus, the Jewish historian who apparently defected to the Romans during this war, this final war from 66 to 73 AD, and surrendered to Vespasian, the first of the Flavian emperors for the Romans, who this is who we're talking about, who wrote the New Testament. The Flavian dynasty was the start of that. It was from 69 to 96 AD. And Vespasian was the first Flavian emperor. And Josephus surrendered to Vespasian, and then he defected to the Romans. He became one of the court historians for Vespasian, and he wrote a 7-volume historical work to great acclaim from the Flavians, both Vespasian and his son Titus. And it's called Wars of the Jews. And we're talking about that a little bit here today. But if you take a look at Wars of the Jews, you will notice that there are some uncanny resemblances between passages in Wars of the Jews and passages in the New Testament, and unbelievable parallels between events occurring in Wars of the Jews and events occurring to Jesus in the New Testament. Such that you will eventually recognize that they were written at the same time by the same people for the same reason. And that reason was to mellow out the Jews and to otherwise humiliate them, to mock them, and ultimately to take their legacy and graft the Romans onto the end of the Jewish legacy. Okay, we're reading from a book here that is called Creating Christ, How the Romans Invented Christianity by James Valliant and C.W. Fahy. And we're talking a little bit about the parallels between Josephus' War of the Jews and his later work, also Antiquities of the Jews, and then also the Gospels, which were written at the same time, even according to scholars, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s AD. Josephus depicts the Essenes' political zeal as rooted in their fervent adherence to the Torah, and kosher diet in particular. He therefore implicitly claims that his own bona fides reside in both the Pharisees and those who went into the wilderness, such as the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarians. But something has definitely changed in Josephus between his early writing of Wars of the Jews and his later writing of Antiquities. And it's generally considered Wars of the Jews came out in the mid-70s and Antiquities of the Jews probably in the early to mid-90s. So about 20-year period there. The whole time during which Josephus was living at Caesar's palace. Or what is one of the court historians there. So he is an agent of the Roman Caesars during this entire period. Whoever he is, whatever his story, whether you believe the fanciful tale about surrendering to Vespasian, or whether you think that Josephus was a think tank of Roman intellectuals working at the court, or whatever you think, or whether he was the Piso family. These are different opinions from different authors that support the Roman origins hypothesis. And it becomes somewhat divisive because ultimately it really doesn't matter. The important thing is that the New Testament was written by the Roman Caesars. Not sure which Roman Caesars, not sure whether it was agents of the Roman Caesars or really the Caesars, or a large group of them, or just one of them, or what it was. And that ultimately is kind of a red herring and doesn't matter too much. What really matters is that the Gospels are fiction, and that they were written by the Romans as a psychological operation against the Jews. And of course they were, because everything is a psychological operation. We're discovering that one episode at a time. And we just haven't gone back far enough in our survey to recognize that Christianity falls in the same bucket as all this other stuff. It's a psyop. It didn't happen. And anybody who really applies conspiracy theory, digging, truther techniques to this will see that it's very obvious, because it looks exactly like a psyop. It's kind of like the quintessential version of a psyop. It looks exactly like what a psyop looks like. And it was performed by exactly the people that would have performed such a psychological operation. There's hardly any holes that you can poke into it. It's very. I mean, I've read several books of Christian apologetics, and they don't even dent this theory because mostly they're based on the idea that if there is no better explanation, then you go with God did it or, Jesus did it. But if there's a better explanation, but they're just not aware of this better explanation. But this is a much better explanation than to go with a bunch of supernatural stuff and assume that's what happened. This is nothing supernatural about this. It's just a lot of wealth, a lot of resources, a lot of, hatred, and a fair amount of perversion and generally evil, what you might call evil. Anyway, between Wars of the Jews and Jewish antiquities, something ideological has happened. Josephus has begun to contradict himself about the identity and nature of the rebels with whom he associated in his youth. Like Jesus and Paul, Josephus, too, ran afoul of the Jewish priesthood in Jerusalem, who he says contrived how they might catch him by treachery. Again, another parallel with the life of Jesus. It seems the same elite priesthood of the Sanhedrin that convicted Jesus and condemned Paul also accused Josephus of betraying the Jews. The striking similarities in the stories told about Jesus, Josephus, and Paul are hard to miss. The most remarkable coincidence between Josephus and Paul, however, is a dramatic event that both of them experienced, a shipwreck on their way from Judea to Rome. So both Josephus and Paul in the book of Acts write about a shipwreck on the way from Judea to Rome that kind of ends up on the island of Malta. We shall now consider and compare the details of these accounts. St. Paul and Flavius Josephus tell extraordinarily coincidental stories. First, Josephus's, and this goes on. This is about a paragraph, a long paragraph, so not too long. First, Josephus's, when I was in the 26th year of my age, and just to let you know, Josephus was said to have been born in 37 AD, so this would make it 62 or 63 AD. It happened that I took a voyage to Rome, and this on the occasion I shall now describe. At the time when Felix was procurator of Judea, there were certain priests of my acquaintance, and very excellent persons they were, on whom a small and trifling occasion he had put into bonds, and sent to Rome to plead their cause before Caesar. These I was desirous to procure deliverance for, and that especially because I was informed that they were not unmindful of piety towards God, even under their afflictions, but supported themselves with figs and nuts. And I'll just tell you, the figs and nuts is a total code word used by Pliny the Younger as well as Josephus, and I think in the New Testament. But the figs and nuts, that just means the phallus and the testicles. Accordingly, I came to Rome though it were through a great number of hazards by sea. For as our ship was drowned in the Adriatic Sea, we that were in it, being about 600 in number, swam for our lives all the night. When, upon the first appearance of the day, and upon our sight of a ship of Cyrene, I and some others, 80 in all, by God's providence, prevented the rest, and were taken up into the other ship. And when I had thus escaped, and was come to Diarchia, which the Italians call Puteoli, here we see vegetarian Jewish sectarians of the John the Baptist and James the Just type, and like Josephus's own one-time rabbi Banus. Josephus refers to these Essene-like prisoners as eaters of figs and nuts. Now let us consider Paul's account of his own shipwreck in the same vicinity from the book of Acts. And this passage is not too long, a little bit longer, but not much. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. It should be recalled that for the ancients, the Adriatic Sea extended well south of the Italian peninsula. When about midnight, the sailors sensed that we were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern, and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Now, just keep in mind that Paul is a prisoner here. So these people are following his orders that he's giving here. Maybe they think he's just so advanced that, they might as well heed what he says. Anyway, just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. I'll also tell you that eating bread to break a 2-week fast is a very, very bad idea. That is not what you want to break a fast with that lasts for 2 weeks. It could kill you by creating a lot of kind of mucus forming, sticky, and hard to digest. You have to break a fast gently with food that's very easy to digest, like fruit. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board, which is also an important marker there. 276 is a triangular number, as is 120. Unfortunately, 90 is not. 91 is a triangular number. And these triangular numbers were all put in there by the Romans in the book of Acts and the book of John to emphasize the Trinity. They were trying to, the book of Acts and the book of John were trying to push the idea of the Trinity. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The Father was Vespasian, the Son was Titus, and the Holy Spirit was Domitian, Titus's younger brother. They were all emperors of the Flavian dynasty. So this is back to the book of Acts. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow struck fast and would not move. And the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. In contrast to Paul, that's the end of the passage. In contrast to Paul, Josephus's wrecked ship carried about 600 people, more than twice the 276 on Paul's ship. Oddly, both accounts specify the number of passengers, a detail that establishes a difference between them. In Josephus's case, the ship's passengers desperately swim to another ship that takes them to Puteoli, while after Paul's shipwreck, they improbably swim all night and make it to the island of Malta. In both stories, parties of Jewish prisoners are on their way to Rome to try their cases before Nero. Just as in Paul's story, Josephus's friends were in bonds for what can only be messianic beliefs that the Romans consider threatening. Apparently, both ships full of suspected Jewish rebels took on water in the Adriatic Sea and sank, forcing their passengers to swim for their lives, only to be miraculously saved on their way to judgment before Caesar in Rome. In one of these shipwreck stories, the dietary habits of the prisoners are mentioned. In the other, Paul urges them to eat bread and almost performs a Christian communion or mass while feeding them. Both shipwrecks happen at night, at the end at dawn, and end at dawn. And in both, all the passengers are miraculously saved. Could these events, like other dubiously duplicated people and events we have already seen, be one and the same? The book of Acts says that Paul was sent to Rome by the order of the Judean governor Festus, who governed between 60 and 62 AD or CE. Josephus says that he was about 26 years old when he went to Rome, and this would place his voyage in the year 63 CE. But that's not what he says. He says he was in his 26th year, meaning that he was 25 years old, which would take the event into the next governorship of Albinus. So he's putting it at 63, but it's really 62, which matches up with Governor Festus. So, Either way. However, Josephus mentions that the prisoners he was accompanying to Rome as their advocate had been arrested under the governorship of Felix, who governed from 52 to 60. Just as the book of Acts says that Paul was first arrested by Felix and kept under guard until the time of Festus, who then ordered him to Rome. While Festus ordered Paul sent to Rome, however, the voyage itself might well not have occurred until early in Albinus's governorship, around 63, the same year of Josephus's voyage. Most Christians today place Paul's arrival in Rome in the year 60. But Christian tradition has repeatedly associated the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul with the Great Fire of Rome, a tradition famously included in the historical novel Quo Vadis by Henryk Sienkiewicz. And that is a book that I tried to read for a little while, and I don't know what happened, but I'll try it again someday. If this tradition is correct, then Paul could not have died until 64, a date consistent with his arrival in the previous year, because that year is when there was the fire in Rome. A date consistent with his arrival the previous year, the same year that Josephus arrived in Rome via shipwreck. None of this suggests that either shipwreck story is historical. A story about either man surviving a shipwreck on their way to Rome is somewhat fantastic and may be allegorical, however common real shipwrecks might have been on the ancient Mediterranean Sea. What's interesting is that Josephus's account can be correlated so closely in both time and metaphor with Paul's story in Acts. Okay, I think we're going to stop right there. Didn't really cover all that much, but did get to look at the comparisons between Paul's shipwreck and Josephus's shipwreck. And there's certainly enough to raise a little bit of suspicion, but not enough to say anything definitive. But when you start adding up all the different pieces, the hundreds or even thousands of different pieces of things that are suspicious, then, it starts to get overwhelming. How many coincidences does it take before it becomes mathematically impossible? Okay, like, share, subscribe, comment, contribute, and come back tomorrow for another episode of Bible Decode. Thanks for tuning in today, and have a great day.